Hello friends, welcome to my Pessimistic Guide to Anti-Aging Research, episode 14. I'm still in Moscow, and as a side note, I have never seen Moscow like this at the end of November. Climate change in action, and it looks somewhat scary to me. Today, I decided to talk about the state of affairs with Alzheimer's and other dementias, which are inextricably linked to the growth of the number of elderly people. The elderly account for 34% of the total health budget. The number of over 65 years old in the United States of America is projected to reach 88 million by 2050, and higher than 14% of this number will suffer from dementia. With regard to the Alzheimer's and other dementias, much of the burden of caring for demented elders naturally falls on the shoulders of the family members. Americans, for example, dedicate almost 18 billion unpaid hours to care for cognitively impaired seniors. Yet, in the grand scheme of things, all these efforts seem like a losing proposition because we fight for the lives of those who are already lost. Personally, I'm not convinced that maintaining human life at any cost is always humane. I also think that there are such things as unbearable pain, emotional suffering, and the ultimate indignity of losing oneself that make death a welcome relief and the only sensible and humane option. Very personally, I do not want my worn-out body to go on existing if I am no longer there. People should not be reduced to the status of mementos or souvenirs to be kept for what purpose exactly? Sometimes it is very difficult to be merciful. By the way, I am old enough to treat this question as a matter of the foreseeable future. I do not think that one can be dragged out of this abyss if he or she is already there. The only feasible option is to work on strategies for preventing or delaying the development of dementia beyond the point when some other deficiency becomes a primary cause of death, much like in the beginning of the 20th century, when life expectancy was about 45 years and therefore dementia was not an issue. There are also some unintended consequences. As I mentioned, demented patients require constant monitoring and comprehensive care, shouldered in many cases by family members. Depending on the emotional context, different types of care may have an opposite effect on life expectancy. For example, caregiving for grandchildren reduces mortality risks by 37% compared to non-grandparents and grandparents who do not provide child care. I myself can testify that caring for a grandchild is, extremely taxing, but it also gives more pleasure than just about anything else in the world. In contrast, in the negative emotional context, caregivers experiencing caregiver strain have much higher mortality risks than non-caregivers of matching age. In other words, it is quite possible that family members extend the lifespan of their demented loved ones by simply donating a few years of their own. Let me ask you, is it a fair exchange? Well, one might say that any sacrifice based on love is justified, and yet, to those who are not actors in this particular tragedy, it may seem like a very unequal trade. Maybe you're lucky and not yet exposed to this horror within your family. You can, however, go to the Facebook groups related to dementias just to get a feel of the intensity of suffering, love, and sacrifice spilling out of every post. It is heartbreaking, especially knowing that there is nothing currently available that can lighten the burden that these amazing human beings carry for years and sometimes for decades. Let's talk about crude biology. I do not mean to be comprehensive, because A, it is not possible within this format, and B, more importantly, I'm simply not qualified enough. Nonetheless, Before we proceed with a brief review of modern and prospective Alzheimer's treatments, let's see what we are facing in biological terms, the way I see it. There are two components of age-specific brain decay: irreversible cell loss and increasing functional decline of surviving cells. The functional decline is undoubtedly caused by a plethora of mechanisms of aging, ranging from inadequate nutrient supply, toxins, inflammation, accumulation of mutations, epigenetic decay, mitochondrial dysfunction, etc. These multiple mechanisms are slowly devouring our brains over our lifetimes. Lost cells are just that, lost cells. Associated with lost cells, connections are also severed, so there is an irreversible damage to the brain architecture as well. Presumably, memories associated with some of these cells are also gone. Altogether, about a third of cells and connections vanish forever from the brains of 80-year-olds. On top of it, a significant fraction of surviving cells exhibits markers of senescence. We also need to appreciate the challenges facing researchers designing clinical trials related to Alzheimer's or any other form of dementia. How the hell do you evaluate the efficiency of the proposed treatment in a relatively short-term trial with patients who were on a downward slope for some time? They lost a considerable fraction of neurons already. In addition, another considerable fraction is senescent and therefore no longer rescuable, at least for now. This means that only a relatively small number of cells can be rehabilitated, and that only modest improvements can be realistically expected by default. On the other hand, the proper way to deal with Alzheimer's would be to find treatments that would prevent or delay cell loss, development of senescence and dysfunction. This means that the treatments have to be started at tender age to be truly effective. By the way, we already have at least one such remedy: education. Constantly challenging our brain, going to college, obtaining a degree, leading intellectually active life appears to be the strongest protection against the accelerated development of dementia. On the other hand, the proper clinical trials of required duration and magnitude are simply impossible. The only option is to approve the drug on the basis of questionable data, release it into the wild, and wait a few decades until it proves or disproves itself in tens of thousands of patients. So, what do we have right now? The majority of new therapies which are currently in clinical trials are directed at alleviating disruptive behavioral patterns, for example, facilitating signal transmission, improving metabolism, and the partial rehabilitation of dysfunctional cells. The dominant approaches allegedly addressing the core mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease are based on amyloid cascade and tau phosphorylation theories, which I discussed in my previous episodes, and which, I think, are a dead end and a drain of resources. In my opinion, there was nothing dramatically new in the last few years, apart from various modifications of anti-amyloid therapies. For those who are wondering why, I accidentally came up with one possible contributing factor. The primary entity giving money for research in the USA is National Institutes of Health, NIH. Out of sheer curiosity, I went to NIH site and checked the roster of reviewers of grant applications for clinical neuroscience and neurodegeneration study section. This study section's stated purpose is to address the mechanisms and management of human chronic neurodegenerative diseases and neurocognitive disorders. It turns out that the section is composed of 22 scientists, of which 14 specialize in different aspects of dementias. Of these 14, 6 work within the framework of amyloid and tau theories. This all but guarantees that almost every dementia-related application will have at least one reviewer with amyloid or tau professional bias. I do not think it qualifies as a conscious sabotage, but I do think that it qualifies as a subconscious impediment to the acceptance of alternative ideas. So, I call for democratization of research on dementias because any form of obsession with a certain and especially discredited idea is unhealthy. Should I also mention that the science directed by the mafia that has formed around distribution of funds for research is potentially deadly for all of us? Should I also note that mafia bosses will face dementia sooner or later, and that it is in their own interests to promote unbiased activity in this area, even if their short-term interests are somewhat hurt. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say today. See you next time.